You guys really like these videos, so here's another one. Becoming a monster is one of the most tried and true tropes of horror, and for good reason. It flips the very concept of monster stories on their head. Sure, a monster's scary when they're chasing you down, but if the monster is a part of you, or becomes you entirely, then you have an entire new dynamic to work with. One that becomes personal, introspective, and extremely varied in just how many things you can do with it. We all know the archetypical examples: werewolves, certain kinds of vampires, even demonic possessions, all fall into the trope of becoming the monster. As it were, many of my favorite horror or horror-adjacent stories use this trope, and I think it's that introspective aspect of them that I like the most. As for our discussion here today, we're going to organize the video by first talking about how one actually becomes a monster, and then the different ways one can take a story past that point. Part 1 is the change. While conceptually the simplest stage of the process, the portion of your story before your character actually becomes the monster can be one of the absolute most important of them, as not only may it foreshadow the transformation, but it will also justify it and set expectations for what the audience should be seeing. Those expectations can be very, very vague, and in many cases they're better off extremely minimal, but with a monstrous transformation being such a fundamental shift in the dynamic of a character's journey, it's worth doing some legwork before things really get going. There are several ways to do this. It isn't uncommon for the process of becoming a monster to already be common knowledge in universe. That's to say, whatever your character will become is something of a known quality within your world. It's common to much werewolf or vampire media that receiving a bite from that respective monster can confer their curse upon the bitten. This can vary in forms and doesn't even have to be too specific. In Warhammer Fantasy, their vampires have something called the Dark Kiss or the Blood Kiss, and it's actually meant to be sort of specific to every vampire as to how they transfer it, which is a little bit ominous. But that's to say that it doesn't have to be the archetypical I bite you on the neck thing. All the same, the point of me saying this is that when you're doing this method, the type of beast is known, and the concept that a mortal person can become one is an already established fact. This is probably the easiest way to set this up, as it means as long as it is in some way naturally brought up beforehand, the audience will buy the transformation when it starts to happen. A problem can arise in that whole, in some way naturally brought up part, as any direct reference to, yeah, there are vampires and if you get bit, you become one, may spoil what the plot is going to be if it's something you're trying to keep secret. It doesn't have to be secret, and if so, then go ham with this method. It'll save you time and nobody will be left wondering. It may be archetypal, but archetypal and bad are not synonyms, especially if you have your own takes on these archetypes. Not to mention, you may actually be able to get away with not talking too much about the transformation in universe anyway, as if it's going to be relatively standard, most people already know how it works before they even start your story. However, there are of course plenty of ways to do it, even if the process is not known about in world. Two good and very different examples of this would be the Clive Barker film Nightbreed and the Aaron Dembski-Bowden book The First Heretic, which is the best Horus Heresy novel, in my humble opinion. In Nightbreed, our protagonist, Boone, dreams of monsters. The movie's extremely fast pace means that we don't actually know a whole lot about the why or the how of that, but these monsters he dreams of are said to come from a place called Midian, where all can go to be redeemed of their sins. Spoiler for a 35-year-old movie, but the doctor he's been going to see for consultation about these dreams, Decker, is a serial killer, and he manipulates both Boone and the local police agency into thinking that Boone is the one responsible for Decker's murders. At the beginning of the movie, especially since I went in completely blind, it seemed that the whole monstrous dreams thing might just be that. But after Boone gets hit by a truck and he ends up in a hospital with a guy who wants to cut his own face off, bear with me, it's a bit of a strange movie. Or alternatively, looking at literally any of the readily available promotional material, which I didn't for some reason, one will discover that there will, in fact, be actual monsters in this movie. This is confirmed when Boone finds Midian, gets bit by a tentacle-headed red dude, gains about 30 new orifices by way of cop, walks it off, and then jumps out a window. After the extremely fevered pace in which all of that happens, all of this being in like the first 30 minutes of the movie, you're left mentally catching up, but pretty much accepting what just happened if only because the movie has just yanked you by the collar into the next scene before you have time to think about what just happened. And as much as I'm teasing it, I actually did like the movie. Anyway, an alternate approach, one that's more measured, is in The First Heretic. Without making this video about 14 hours long, and explaining all the run-up to make the background of Warhammer make kind of sense, I'll just say that there are these mega buff space soldiers, which I have an inordinate amount of on my desk, and they and their leader have been majorly chastised by the Emperor they serve, so their leader starts having a bit of an edgy experimental phase. Thus, they find a dimensional rift and decide, after watching a blood sacrifice on a nearby planet and capturing a demon, that going inside the dimensional rift is the thing to do. They also bring that demon with them into said dimensional rift, which is just an excellent idea, I'm sure. In that dimensional rift, they see the fall of an ancient empire and might also indirectly be the cause for the series of events that leads to Warhammer sucking terribly. And then, of course, they all get killed by the demon. Who could have guessed that might happen? At that point, you've already seen so much crazy stuff that when their corpses are then possessed by demons, thus reanimating the people inside, you really aren't questioning that part too much. And it's all done well enough that even the crazier stuff feels about right, and somehow, despite the objectively terrible idea that all of this was, you're even sympathizing with the characters involved. Really, if you have at least a little background in 40k and Chaos in particular and want somewhere to start, read The First Heretic. It is so good. All of this is said to say that realistically, the amount of ways you can see the transformation happen are infinitely varied. It can be so quick it leaves you spinning, or just be part of a grand opera of damnation. But now we move on to part 2, A Dark Fall. This part will be about the idea of a monstrous transformation as a negative. We're starting with it because it is by far the most common way of looking at monstrous transformations, and the most commonly seen in folk tales and such. Speaking of, one of the core examples here is going to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm sure you know the story, at least in part already, but it essentially goes as thus. Dr. Jekyll is a respectable, good-natured man, yet he has these evil urges. He uses a serum he concocted to transform into his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, commit whatever evil acts his urges might demand, and then transform back, sated, for now. As one might see coming from about 1,000 miles away, this is not in fact a good long-term plan, and over time, the Hyde side gets more and more uppity, up to and including committing murders, and Jekyll grows more desperate to stop Hyde. But it's too late. Now he transforms into Hyde even when he doesn't imbibe the serum, and one time it happens while he's awake. Jekyll can feel his consciousness being lost, being subsumed by the beast that is Hyde, and eventually succumbs to and accepts his fate of being swallowed whole, disappearing mind and body alike. And thus this form of the monstrous transformation is often going to be portrayed as a physical manifestation of the evils and sins of your target character. Something corporeal to match their moral degradation or something of that sort. In the case of Jekyll, it is Jekyll letting his dark urges get the better of him. For even if he isn't the one consciously committing Hyde's crimes, he is at best aiding and abetting him, and is the only reason that those crimes were even possible in the first place. Thus, in his moral failing, he is doomed to fall. However, even in a negative monster transformation, you don't have to do it this way. Especially if you're aiming for real horror, the monstrous transformation being thrust upon a person not at all deserving of that fate is going to be one of the most effective ways to add impact to your end result, especially if we as the audience are given time to care about them. This is pretty much the main area in which zombie stories end up having their emotional punches. Take the first of the Walking Dead games, where Lee, the prospective character of the game, ends up being infected with the zombie virus at the very end. The prospect of him transforming into a zombie is horrible to the extent that it is generally considered the better option to have Clementine, a child, kill him preemptively. I still consider that situation to count for our purposes, because there, the plot drama is executed in preventing a monstrous transformation in general, which is still using the same relative principles, so I call it fair enough. The next topic within a negative fall will be the degree of control maintained by the person who becomes the monster. In the other sorts, this aspect may not be as emphasized, if perhaps still present, but a total loss of control, as evidenced by the Jekyll and Hyde example, is a common motif. With those, it's fairly simple, as once the transformation completes, the character loses their agency within the story and essentially, for story structure purposes, becomes a different character, just with baggage attached. However, there is something to be said for the character maintaining control despite their fall being a negative thing. This can be because the nature of the monster corrupts them in some way, or perhaps the treatment they experience or perspective they gain just adjusts their outlook in some way. While Frankenstein's monster isn't really a transformed monster in the conventional sense, there is the concept that he was a friendly enough being at first, but his terrible mistreatment by others leads him to social ostracization, and thus drives him in part to do the things that he does. This approach can definitely be effective, so long as this change in character is justified. That's often not too hard to pull off, because transforming into a monster is definitely something I believe may have deleterious effects on one's psyche. Then of course you can place it somewhere in the middle, which often manifests as a sort of monstrous pull on the psyche that may lead to phases of normalcy and phases of bestial monstrosity or bloodlust. This is the werewolf example, where one is essentially a normal person save on the full moon when the transformation repeats. However, though I'll talk about this example more later, we do see a little bit of this in Nightbreed, where it seems several of even the more generally friendly monsters do have a certain lust for blood and violence. Anyway, that leads us to Part 3, a Fell Ascension. And what if your transformation turns out to be a good thing? This phenomenon is markedly less common and generally newer. Traditional tales tend to not particularly love the idea of monstrous transformations, especially since those sorts of things were often wrapped up in all sorts of socio-cultural anxieties about different lifestyles, disabilities, or essentially anything that wasn't considered normal. However, in more recent times, the monstrous transformation as a positive has been skewed as one embracing their true self in some form or fashion. This isn't how it has to be done, but it seems to be the prevailing trope. Then, of course, it'll often be paired with the related trope of humans being the true monsters. This is very much the case in that movie I was talking about earlier, Nightbreed. Boone's transformation into one of the Nightbreed, though it has some spooky ramifications and repeatedly gets him into trouble, is very clearly meant to be a positive for him, especially since the movie's surprisingly wholesome ending results in his girlfriend also becoming a Nightbreed so that they can continue to be together. In either case, this group of Nightbreed he becomes a part of are being sought out by the local police, that serial killer, and a bunch of yokels who want to wipe them all out. Considering the Nightbreed have essentially been minding their own business in the catacombs below Midian for what seems to have been a very long time, the scene that plays out is much reminiscent of any number of horrible persecutions throughout history. And thus, the Nightbreed defend themselves and defeat the people attacking them. However, for a more familiar example that might actually be surprising in the sense that you may not have thought about it this way before, Space Marines. Now, you could well argue that they fall into the next category, but hear me out. When not being flanderized in any number of ways by the 40k fanbase, Space Marines are definitely monsters. They're 8 feet tall, they're given 22 new organs, they're made almost entirely of pure muscle and chemical cocktails, and the majority of their humanity is ripped right out of them. Also that they can transform into the most efficient soldiers possible. Who am I kidding? This is 40k, efficiency is nowhere in the dictionary, but effective would be an accurate term. They fight for centuries or even over 1,000 years before inevitably falling in combat. Their armor and their gene seed gets harvested so that they can be replaced, and then on the cycle continues. It isn't pleasant, and we are meant to consider it pretty horrific, but for the Marines themselves, it is considered a great honor and a necessary thing to do to ensure humanity's survival. In a humorously comparable way, their arch-enemies, the Forces of Chaos, have a relatively similar system. The general idea is if you're a mortal who worships the Chaos Gods, your ultimate goal is to ascend to demonhood by doing something horrible enough to earn such a reward from your dark patrons. If you die any time along the path, your soul in all likelihood gets consumed, but if you get to the very top, immortality awaits. Both Space Marines and Demon Princes are things we probably wouldn't actually want to be, but in terms of how they are portrayed within their own context, both ascensions are positive in that way. So that's another way you can do a positive monstrous ascension. something that is in some way horrific and does result in someone becoming something monstrous, but in a way that is necessary or at least beneficial to the ones experiencing it. Of course, even with all the options I've mentioned thus far, exploring monstrosity in a positive light is, as said, a bit newer, so there are a lot of concepts to further discuss within that topic. I mean, what even is a monster? Is one still monstrous if their transformation into one is a positive experience? There are a lot of ideas to delve into. Anyway, with that, we get into our last category, Part 4, Mixed Blessings. If I had a favorite category, it just might be this one, because as I like to aspire to on this channel, we here at JBat are nuance enjoyers. Some of the negative transformations from earlier have positive connotations. Some of the positive ones from the last section have negative connotations, especially the Space Marines and the Demon Princes. In either case, Mixed Blessings for monstrous transformations allows you to have your cake and eat it too. It gives you access to all of the associated ideas. Loss of identity, body horror, becoming subject to metaphysical entities or ravenous hunger, while still allowing it to be a power-up or happen for a good reason. It isn't that you can't do these things with a primarily negative or primarily positive outlook, just that when the focus is on balancing them out with one another, you can achieve a sort of tense discomfort in the audience that I really find enjoyable. My favorite example of this would be from that Warhammer book, The First Heretic. So, our protagonist, whose name is Argel Tal, is possessed by a demon from that funny event from earlier. However, this doesn't go for him quite as bad as you might expect, at least not right away. His brain case does need to make room for two, as now a demon named Raum is in there as well. As it turns out, this isn't a mixed blessing because Raum is actually a nice guy sometimes. He's not. He's still a demon and encourages Argel to do bad things pretty consistently. But the reason that it's mixed is because Argel is able to resist this influence. He doesn't immediately become evil just because this has happened to him, nor does he really lose control. Instead, tapping into the demonic side becomes a sort of dark temptation. The sort of thing he'll do in combat to boost his power level and win a fight. He grows new appendages, including these absolutely baller wings, and becomes significantly more durable. Despite all of this, in part due to his group's lack of knowledge on what exactly they're dealing with, due to the Emperor deciding not to tell anybody about the Eldritch Gods of Chaos or how they can corrupt you or how they can possess you or how they can do any number of terrible things to you, it doesn't become as much of a subject of horror as you'd expect. Space Marines, of which Argel Tal is one, are meant to be living weapons fighting for a greater cause, an idea that's almost still believable around that point in time, and so this demonic transformation that in any other story would be the subject of extreme terror becomes another tool in the toolbox, so to speak, especially since Argel Tal's leader, Lorgar, is very supportive of this entire demonic possession process. However, we get to follow Argel Tal later in a couple following books, including Betrayer. He does fall, but not in the way you'd think. He and his legion turn against the Emperor for reasons that do actually make some sense. Namely, that the Emperor was such a Reddit atheist that he burned down a city because of it, and Lorgar was pretty unhappy about that. The events thus unfold in a way that sees Argel Tal and the people around him actually start doing pretty terrible things, but it's more of a result of them having taken a side in a massive galactic conflict than because of this monstrous transformation. And in the end, it isn't the demon Raum that kills Argel Tal, but it's that bastard Erebus. In the end, a monstrous transformation as a mixed blessing, or a positive or a negative, is all a matter of perspective. At the end of the day, a monstrous transformation is becoming something other than human. The exact form may vary and what it does to you may change, but at the end of the day, this concept has been taken in all sorts of directions and can be used for all sorts of purposes, which is why I find it to be such a fascinating trope. But with that, I think we've about discussed becoming the monster in horror, and how you might implement such concepts into your own stories or recognize them in others. If you have any thoughts of your own about monstrous transformations or stories that display this trope in interesting ways, let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBat, every single like and subscription go quite a long way. Anyway, if you want to hang out with my editor and I, we do have a Discord, and if for some reason you're crazy enough to want it, we have Patreon and channel memberships, all linked in the description below. I've also got to thank Shadowrunner, our $10 patron and a knight of the Inner Circle. I'm also going to say, new color actually fits the channel theme. Don't know how it'll show up on camera or if it'll match. but trying something new. With that being said, remember, if symptoms of monstrous transformations persist, consult a doctor.